It was Thanksgiving, and I had spent hours in the kitchen preparing Max's favorite dishes. The smell of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie filled the air, wrapping the small apartment in a warm, comforting embrace. Thanksgiving had always been special in our family, and I was determined to make this one memorable. After all, it's been months since I last saw him, and I wanted everything to be perfect. Max, with his expensive suits and busy lifestyle, had become somewhat distant. It wasn't that he didn't care. It's just that, over the years, we had grown apart. His life had become a whirlwind of meetings, business trips, and high-profile deals, while mine had remained grounded in the same routine, working as a cleaning supervisor at the local hospital. I had watched him build an empire from nothing. At 34, he was a highly successful real estate developer with a multi-million-dollar business, and I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of pride and sorrow when I thought about how much he had accomplished. He had everything: wealth, a beautiful wife, and the kind of life I had only dreamed of. I lived a simple life, one of constant hard work and sacrifice. My job, while essential, barely kept me afloat. I often had to make difficult choices, rationing my blood pressure medication, skipping meals to ensure the rent was paid, or walking to work just to save a few extra dollars for necessities. But I told myself it would get better. Max had promised me that when he was successful, he'd help me, that I wouldn't have to struggle anymore. I believed him with all my heart. I imagined that once his business took off, he would buy me a nice house, take me on vacations, and help me live the life I had always dreamed of. I had worked hard to raise him as a single mother, sacrificing so much so that he could have a better future, and I believed he would be there for me when I needed him the most. I remember the last time I saw him before Thanksgiving. He had called to say he was busy with work and wouldn't be able to make it. It was a phone call that came as no surprise. I was used to it by now. But this year, I wasn't going to let it slide. I had planned the dinner carefully, choosing recipes Max had always loved, even though the grocery bill had meant skipping my lunch for the next week. My kitchen, though small, was brimming with pots, pans, and trays filled with food, each one a labor of love. As I stirred the stuffing, I could almost hear Max's voice in my head, telling me how much he loved it. I smiled, despite the exhaustion that weighed on me. I had made these dishes for him since he was a little boy, and even though he was grown now, I couldn't help but hold on to the traditions that once brought us close. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, maybe things would go back to the way they were. When Max and Isabelle arrived that evening, I was taken aback by how effortlessly everything about them screamed luxury. Max walked in wearing a bespoke suit, his watch gleaming in the dim light, and Isabelle, his wife of 3 years, wore a cream-colored coat that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of how to greet them, not because I wasn't happy to see them, but because their presence made me acutely aware of how different our worlds had become. Isabelle's blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her smile, though warm, seemed a little too polished, too practiced. She was everything I wasn't: beautiful, fashionable, and perfectly put together. I did my best to mask my insecurities, to push aside the nagging feeling that I no longer belonged in their world. "Mom, the place smells incredible," Max said, pulling me into a quick hug before stepping back to help Isabelle with her coat. It was a simple gesture, but it made me feel like I was just part of the background, like an accessory to their glamorous lives. I watched them with a mixture of admiration and sadness, my heart heavy with unspoken words. Max had grown up so quickly, so far removed from the boy I had raised, and I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him to a world I could never be a part of. We sat down to dinner, and I listened as Max and Isabelle discussed their latest vacation to the Maldives, their plans for expanding their real estate portfolio, and the newest renovations they were making to their home. I smiled and nodded, trying to keep up with their conversation, but the truth was, their world felt increasingly foreign to me. I poured them wine, passing the dishes around, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I tried to keep the conversation light, focusing on the food and the few shared memories we had left. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. Max was so caught up in his own life, in the whirlwind of his success, that I felt invisible. Isabelle chimed in occasionally, talking about the business deals she was involved in and the future they were building together, and I felt like I was fading into the background of their perfect life. Then, as I was serving the mashed potatoes, Max leaned back in his chair, his face relaxing into a smile. "Mom, I've been meaning to ask you about something," he said casually, his voice full of confidence, the kind that comes from years of success. "How are you liking the beach house I gave you?" I stopped mid-motion, the spoon hovering above the mashed potatoes. I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. My heart started to race. "What beach house?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Max's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You know, the one I got for you 2 years ago. I thought you'd be enjoying it by now. It's by the water, just like you always wanted." I shook my head slowly, confusion creeping over me. "Max, I've never gotten any beach house. What are you talking about?" I felt the words slip out before I could stop them, my voice laced with disbelief. Max looked confused, glancing over at Isabelle, who was suddenly very still beside him. "The one on Crestview Beach. I had it transferred to your name. Remember? It was for your birthday 2 years ago." I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. "Max, I would remember something like that. I've never seen any beach house, let alone received one." My voice cracked, and I had to steady myself on the back of the chair. The unease I had felt earlier in the evening suddenly felt like an avalanche, threatening to bury me under the weight of his words. Max was looking at me now, his brow furrowed, disbelief written all over his face. But I've been sending you the monthly payments, Mom. You've been getting them, right? I've been sending you $2,000 a month." My legs suddenly felt weak. $2,000 a month. The exact amount I'd been struggling to make do without. "What?" I whispered, my mind reeling. "I haven't received any payments, Max. You've been sending money for 2 years, and I've never seen a cent." The room spun, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. My heart raced in my chest as I realized what had just been said. The sinking feeling in my stomach grew heavier with each passing second. Max stood up abruptly, the sound of his chair scraping across the floor harsh against the quiet. His face, usually calm and composed, was now twisted in confusion and disbelief. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me as he began scrolling through his phone, tapping away furiously. His voice was laced with frustration as he muttered under his breath, "This doesn't make sense. I have the receipts. I've been paying every month. I have all the documentation." I stared at him, feeling the room tilt beneath me as if the floor was slowly crumbling away. $2,000 a month. I couldn't understand how I could have missed that. I had been struggling to pay bills, scraping together what little I could to make ends meet. I thought of the last 2 years. Rationing my blood pressure medication, skipping meals just to make sure I had enough for rent. I had never seen a penny of that money. Isabelle stood up too, her movements quick and awkward as she hurried toward the kitchen. I noticed her face had gone pale, her usual composure completely shattered. She pulled her phone from her pocket and, without saying a word, stepped into the kitchen, leaving the two of us in the living room, the silence between us now thick with unspoken words. "Show me the receipts, Max," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of confusion swirling in my mind. I needed to see the proof, needed to make sense of what was happening. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing, instinctive sense that I was missing something. Max's fingers flew over the phone screen, and soon he was holding it out for me to see. There were emails, transaction records, bank statements, everything he had referenced. I scanned the documents, my eyes moving quickly from one line to the next, but nothing made sense. The account numbers he had been transferring the money to weren't mine. The name on the account wasn't even close to mine. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as the room seemed to blur around me. "That's impossible," I muttered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "I've never seen any of this, Max. Those accounts, those payments, they're not mine." Max's face shifted, his confusion now mixed with a growing unease. But I've been sending the money to this account. You should have received it, Mom. It was set up for you." His voice faltered, the certainty he had earlier beginning to crack. I felt my legs begin to weaken. the weight of the situation settling on me like a lead blanket. Everything was spinning. Max's words, the transactions, the beach house he claimed to have bought me. How could this have happened? How could Max have been so sure and still be so wrong? Max's phone vibrated, and I watched as his expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. He stood up again, pacing, running a hand through his hair as he dialed his assistant, Rebecca. My heart skipped a beat at the mention of her name. I had heard that name often enough, Rebecca, the assistant who helped with everything Max needed. But now, in the midst of this chaos, her name felt like a distant echo, a reminder that something was deeply wrong. "Rebecca, it's Max," he said, his voice sharper now, more forceful. "I need you to pull up the paperwork for the beach house I bought Mom 2 years ago. The deed transfer, the payments, everything." I could feel my chest tightening as I tried to focus on what was happening. My mind was racing. Why hadn't I known about any of this? Where had the money gone? What was going on? I knew Max had been busy, but he had always promised that he would take care of me. He had always made it clear that once he had the means, I wouldn't have to worry anymore. But now, this betrayal was taking shape right before my eyes. Isabel's footsteps echoed back into the living room, but she didn't look at either of us. She went straight to the kitchen counter, her back to us, and pulled out her phone again. Her movements were rushed, almost frantic, but she didn't speak. I couldn't help but notice the way her hands trembled slightly as she dialed, the fidgeting of her fingers betraying her calm exterior. Max had his phone on speaker now, and I heard Rebecca's voice on the other end, clear and crisp. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. I have the deed transfer for the property at Crestview Beach. It was transferred to Margaret Harrison's name on April 15th, 2 years ago. The payment plan was set up as requested, $2,000 every month for the maintenance and taxes." I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I listened. "Crestview Beach?" I repeated quietly, as if saying it aloud would make more sense. That wasn't my house. I had never signed anything for a beach house. Rebecca continued, "I also have the record of the monthly payments being transferred to the account ending in 9156 as per your instructions. All payments have been processed as requested." Max's face went pale as the weight of the words sank in. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've been sending the payments to an account ending in 9156. That's supposed to be my mom's account, but she doesn't even have that account number." A deep silence followed, stretching out between us, heavy and oppressive. Isabel's phone call cut off abruptly, and she turned around, her face flushed with something close to panic. She could no longer hide the truth. Max looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Isabelle," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Do you know anything about this? The payments? The beach house?" Isabelle flinched, the color draining from her face. She stood there, frozen in place, her eyes darting between Max and me, but she didn't speak. The silence was deafening, and it only deepened the suspicion hanging in the air. Max's voice turned cold. "Isabelle, tell me what's going on. Why didn't Mom get the money? Where did it go?" I could see the guilt flicker in Isabelle's eyes as she slowly stepped back toward the kitchen, her hands nervously adjusting the collar of her coat. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She swallowed hard, her eyes avoiding mine. Finally, she spoke, but her voice was strained, forced. I had to borrow the money, Max. My family was in trouble. My parents, they were losing their house, and we needed help. I just needed some time to pay it back." The words hit me like a slap. "Borrowed?" I whispered. "You didn't borrow it, Isabelle. You stole it." Max's face darkened, the shock turning to anger, but his voice remained eerily calm. "You took money that wasn't yours. For 2 years, you've been living off of what was meant for my mother, and you lied to me about it." Isabelle's face crumpled, her mask of composure shattering completely. Her eyes welled up with tears, but they looked more like panic than remorse. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she sobbed. "It started with just one payment. I was going to pay it back, but then things just got out of hand." The room felt suffocating as Isabelle continued to plead, but the words didn't matter anymore. My heart ached, not just from the financial betrayal, but from the fact that the person I had trusted most had knowingly taken what was mine. The sense of betrayal was so deep, I could hardly catch my breath. I looked at Max, his face a mix of confusion, anger, and guilt. He didn't know what to do. He was still reeling from the shock of it all. But I knew what I had to do. It wasn't just the money. It was the trust that had been broken, the bond that had been shattered. Max, I said quietly, my voice steady despite everything. Where is my beach house? Isabelle lowered her gaze, her shoulders shaking as she whispered, It's not here. My family's been living in it, renovating it, all this time. I felt my knees weaken, and I gripped the edge of the table. Everything I had believed in, everything I had worked for, had been a lie. My own son, my own flesh and blood, had been manipulated by the very person I had trusted to be part of our family. It felt like my world was crumbling around me. Max took a deep breath, his eyes now fixed on Isabelle, his voice cold as he said, Pack your things, Isabelle. I want you out. Tonight. The room went silent again, but this time, it was not just the space between Max and Isabelle that had changed. It was the space between me and my own son. The days that followed that Thanksgiving dinner felt like an endless blur. I had always prided myself on my resilience, on my ability to weather any storm that came my way. But this was different. My world had been shattered in ways I never could have imagined. I had spent the last 2 years living in a fog of struggle, thinking that my son Max was helping me. I believed in his promises, in the assurances he had given me when he first started making money. But now, everything felt like a cruel joke. The money, the house, the trust, everything had been ripped away from me by the very person I had trusted most. Max and I hadn't spoken much since the confrontation with Isabelle. His words still echoed in my ears, his voice tinged with anger and disbelief as he processed the betrayal. He had left that night, promising me that he would take care of everything. I'll make it right, Mom, he had said. But his words had felt hollow in the wake of the truth. The truth that his wife, someone I had welcomed into our family, had systematically stolen from me. That she had forged my name, stolen my identity, and used my money to live a life I could only dream of while I had struggled to survive. The next day, Max came to my apartment, his face pale, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. He apologized over and over, as if that could somehow undo the damage. But no amount of apologies could heal the hurt I felt. I had spent the last few days wrestling with my emotions, trying to make sense of the betrayal. How had I not seen it? How had I allowed myself to be so blind to what was happening right under my nose? When Max walked in, his eyes were filled with regret, but there was also something else, something that looked like shame. Mom, he said quietly, his voice strained, I've been working with Rebecca and the lawyers to sort this out. We're going to get the money back. Everything will be fixed. I promise. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. What was there to say? He was doing what he could, I suppose, but the damage had already been done. The trust that had been broken, the way Isabelle had manipulated us both, those things weren't so easily fixed. I had to come to terms with the fact that, while Max had been duped, he still had a role in this. He had trusted Isabelle. He had allowed her to handle things, to make decisions, to take control. And I couldn't help but wonder if he had done that because he didn't want to see the truth. Maybe, deep down, he didn't want to believe that the woman he loved could be capable of such deceit. Max had promised to make it right, but even now, as he sat across from me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I could see the guilt on his face, but I could also see the confusion. The same confusion I had felt when I first found out about the payments. How had we gotten here? How had Isabelle managed to manipulate both of us for so long without either of us noticing? It was maddening. The betrayal felt like a cold, heavy weight in my chest, one that I couldn't seem to shake off, no matter how hard I tried. The weeks that followed were filled with legal meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Max had hired a lawyer, and we started the process of untangling the mess that Isabelle had left behind. As we sifted through the records, it became clear that Isabelle's actions were far worse than I had initially realized. She hadn't just stolen money. She had opened multiple accounts in my name, forged my signature, and used my identity to secure loans and credit cards. The total amount stolen was staggering. Over the course of 2 years, Isabelle had stolen nearly $70,000, and that was just the beginning. Max had been in shock, of course. How could he not be? He had trusted Isabelle completely, believing that she was the supportive, loving wife she had always seemed to be. But now, as the full scope of her deception came to light, he was forced to confront the painful truth. His wife had used him, manipulated him, and stolen from his mother. I could see the pain in his eyes as we went through the documents together. The guilt was eating him alive. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the trust he had placed in Isabelle. The trust that had been shattered beyond repair. I spent a lot of time alone during that period trying to process everything. There were moments when I would sit in my small apartment, the silence pressing in on me, and I would think about how I had gotten here. I had worked so hard all my life, sacrificed so much for Max, and now this. This was how I was repaid. It was hard not to feel bitter, not to feel like I had been taken advantage of. But I also knew that I couldn't let this define me. I had been through too much, overcome too many obstacles to let this break me. The hardest part was coming to terms with the fact that Isabelle had been living a life of luxury on the money that was supposed to help me. The beach house, the vacations, the designer clothes, everything she had enjoyed had been paid for with my money, the money that Max had thought was going to me. I couldn't help but wonder how she had lived with herself, how she had been able to sit at my table, smile at me, and pretend to care while knowing she was stealing from me. One afternoon, after another long meeting with the lawyer, Max and I sat down together in the living room. He looked at me, his face filled with remorse. "I don't know how to make this right, Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "I failed you." I shook my head, not out of anger, but out of a deep, aching sadness. "Max, you didn't fail me, but Isabelle, she's a different story." I paused, taking a breath. "She lied to both of us, but you're still my son, and no matter what happened, I don't want to lose you." Max looked at me, his eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know if I can forgive myself for trusting her. I should have known. I should have seen the signs." "You couldn't have known," I said softly. "She was good at what she did, but I need you to focus on making things right, not just for me, but for yourself too. We can't change what happened, but we can take steps to fix it." Max nodded, wiping his eyes. "I'll make sure you're taken care of, Mom. I'll make this right." I didn't respond. What more was there to say? The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not going to let this define me. Isabelle's betrayal was painful, but it wouldn't break me. I had been through too much already, and I still had a lot of life left to live. The hardest part was over. Now it was time to start rebuilding. As the weeks passed, the legal battles continued, and the restitution process slowly unfolded. But in the quiet moments when I was alone, I started to feel a flicker of something inside me, a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better, something that didn't rely on the lies of others, but on my own strength and resilience. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing. I would face it head on, with my head held high. The weeks after the discovery were a whirlwind of legal meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Max and I spent countless hours poring over documents, trying to untangle the mess that Isabelle had left behind. Every time I thought I understood the full extent of the betrayal, another layer would unfold, revealing more lies, more deception. It felt like I was suffocating in a cloud of confusion and anger, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't allow myself to be consumed by it. This wasn't the end of my life. It was just a setback, a painful one, but one I had to push through. Max, despite his best efforts, couldn't hide his guilt. Every conversation we had was filled with apologies, each one more heart-wrenching than the last. He had been duped by Isabelle, just as I had been. But unlike me, he had believed in her completely. He had trusted her, loved her. And now that trust had been shattered, leaving him as much of a victim as I was. It was difficult for me to watch him spiral into self-blame, but I understood. He felt like he had failed me, that he had been blind to what was happening right under his nose. But I kept telling him the same thing. He couldn't have known. Isabelle had played her part well, and she had used our family's love and trust as her weapon. As for me, I spent most of my time trying to keep my emotions in check. The rage I felt toward Isabelle was all-consuming at times, and I had to remind myself to focus on the practicalities of the situation. I had to recover what was mine, rebuild what had been taken, and learn to move forward. But there were moments, late at night when I was alone in my apartment, that I allowed myself to feel the weight of everything. I thought about the beach house that was supposed to be mine, the money that had been siphoned off, and the years of struggle I had endured, all while Isabelle lived in luxury. It made me sick to think about it. Max had taken charge of the legal aspects of the situation. He had hired a team of lawyers to help us recover the stolen money and deal with the identity theft. Every time I spoke with them, I felt like I was sinking deeper into the chaos. The legal jargon, the endless forms, the mountains of evidence we had to sift through, it was all so overwhelming. But I couldn't back down. I wouldn't. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. One afternoon, Max and I sat in a small conference room with his lawyer, a tall, stern-looking man named Mr. Carter. He was going over the details of the fraud investigation, explaining how they were going to track down the money and pursue criminal charges against Isabelle. I listened quietly, but my mind kept drifting to the one thing I couldn't seem to escape. How could someone who had once been family do this to me? How could Isabelle, who had sat at my table and pretended to care, steal from me so ruthlessly? "Miss Anderson," Mr. Carter said, breaking me from my thoughts. "We've managed to freeze most of Isabelle's accounts, and we've traced the fraudulent payments to several different banks. We're confident we can recover the funds, but this will take time. It's a complicated process." I nodded, trying to absorb the information. Time. I had all the time in the world now, or at least that's how it felt. My life had been put on hold by this betrayal. Every part of me wanted to rush through this process, to be done with it all and move on. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The emotional damage was far more complicated than any legal battle could resolve. Max, sitting beside me, reached over and squeezed my hand. "Mom, I promise we're going to fix this," he said, his voice soft but filled with determination. "I won't let her get away with it. I'll make sure you're taken care of." I forced a smile, grateful for his support, but a part of me couldn't help but feel resentment. How had he not known? How had he allowed Isabelle to manipulate him for so long? I didn't voice these thoughts, though. I knew he was hurting, just as much as I was, and he didn't need to hear my anger. Not yet, anyway. Later that evening, I found myself standing in front of the small mirror in my bathroom, staring at the reflection that seemed to hold so many emotions: anger, pain, confusion, but also something else. Something that surprised me: strength. I had spent so much time thinking about how everything had been taken from me, but looking at myself now, I realized that I still had the power to rebuild. Isabelle had stolen my money, my trust, and my peace of mind, but she hadn't taken my will to move forward. She hadn't taken my ability to stand up for myself. The next few days were filled with more legal meetings, and as the investigation into Isabelle's actions unfolded, I began to realize just how deeply her betrayal had run. It wasn't just the stolen money. It was the way she had used me, manipulated me, into believing I was receiving help, when in reality, she was living a lavish life on the money that was meant for me. The worst part was that I had trusted her. I had welcomed her into my home, into my life, and I had believed she was part of my family. But now everything had changed. Max and I continued to work through the legal process, but I could see that he was struggling with his own feelings of guilt. The guilt was eating him alive, and I knew that, no matter how much he tried to fix things, the damage to our relationship was already done. The trust we had once shared had been shattered. Max had spent years building his empire, but he had never stopped to check on me, to make sure I was okay. He had trusted Isabelle too much, and in doing so, he had allowed her to destroy what we had. Still, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief when we finally managed to trace the stolen money back to Isabelle's accounts. She had been using the funds for everything, from lavish vacations to home renovations, and now we had the evidence to prove it. The idea of getting that money back was comforting, but it didn't undo the pain of knowing that my own flesh and blood had been complicit in this betrayal. One afternoon, as Max and I sat together in my apartment, looking over some paperwork, he sighed and looked at me with a mixture of guilt and determination. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know this isn't enough, but I want to make it right. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I promise I'll always be here for you. I'll make sure you're never in a situation like this again." I looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, I realized that he hadn't been the one to betray me. Isabelle had used him, manipulated him, and turned him against me, but he was still my son. And in that moment, I chose to believe in him again. "I know, Max," I said softly. "I know you're trying, and that's enough for me." It was a small step, but it was the first step toward healing. The road ahead was still long, but I wasn't facing it alone anymore. The truth had come out, and now it was time to move forward. Slowly, carefully, but with the knowledge that I could rebuild what had been broken. It would take time, but I was stronger than I had ever realized, and I wasn't going to let Isabelle or anyone else steal my peace of mind again. The days after that final confrontation with Isabelle felt like a slow unraveling of everything I thought I understood about trust, family, and betrayal. The shock of it all had worn off, but in its place, a new kind of weight settled on my chest. There was a strange emptiness I couldn't shake, a feeling that even though I was starting to rebuild my life, something fundamental had been lost. Max had been by my side, doing everything he could to make amends, but I could tell he was struggling. His guilt hung heavy between us, an invisible barrier that neither of us knew how to break down. We hadn't talked much in the days that followed our last conversation. The silence wasn't angry. It was just tired. We both needed time to process, to come to terms with what had happened. I had always believed that blood was thicker than water, that family should be the one thing you could count on, no matter what. But Isabelle had shattered that belief, and Max, though he was a victim in his own right, had inadvertently helped her destroy everything I held dear. It wasn't easy to reconcile that truth. The ache in my chest felt like it would never go away, no matter how much I tried to push it down or distract myself. I had always been independent, relying on no one but myself. But this betrayal was different. It wasn't just money that had been stolen. It was trust, it was security, and it was the belief that the people I loved would always have my back. Max came by my apartment every few days, his visits at first marked by long silences, as if neither of us knew how to bridge the gap that had formed between us. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but I wasn't sure how to ease it. He had always been my rock, the one who promised he'd take care of me when he made it big. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Our roles had changed, and not in the way I had imagined. He had been the one to build an empire, but I had been the one who had to clean up the mess, both literal and emotional. I had spent so many years supporting him, and now I was the one left to pick up the pieces of my life, alone. The legal proceedings had begun in earnest, and every day felt like a battle. Max had hired the best lawyers to make sure I was compensated, that we could recover the stolen money and secure my future. But every time I stepped into the lawyer's office or sat down with an investigator, I couldn't help but feel like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The paperwork was endless, the phone calls never stopped, and each new revelation about Isabelle's fraud felt like another wound that would never heal. We had uncovered credit cards, loans, and other accounts she had opened in my name, and the total amount stolen had climbed higher and higher. It was hard to keep track of it all. I felt like I was drowning in paperwork and the weight of everything Isabelle had done. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Max showed up at my door. His face was drawn, tired, but there was something else there, something more determined than I had seen in him for weeks. I let him in, and we sat down at the small kitchen table, the same one where we had shared countless meals over the years. The irony wasn't lost on me. This table had always been a place of connection, a place where we had shared our lives, and now it felt like a battleground. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Max said, his voice soft but steady. "I know I can't undo what happened. I know I can't fix it, but I need to do something for you, Mom. I need to make things right." I looked at him, unsure of what to say. His words were well-meaning, but they didn't change the fact that Isabelle had taken so much from me. They didn't change the hurt that ran deeper than just the financial losses. They didn't change the fact that, for 2 years, I had lived in a lie, thinking I was supported, thinking I was safe. But there was something in his eyes, something that told me he was trying, really trying, to fix what had been broken. I don't know if anything can make this right, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. But I appreciate that you're trying. Max nodded, his gaze dropping to the table for a moment before meeting mine again. I've been thinking about the beach house, he said, and I could see the pain in his eyes. The one that was supposed to be yours. I want to make sure you have a place of your own. I want to make sure you're never in a situation like this again. I felt my heart twist in my chest. The beach house, what was supposed to be my safe haven, had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. But I could see that Max wasn't just talking about the house. He was talking about my future, about making sure I was taken care of. He wasn't talking about the material things anymore. He was talking about making sure I was never left in the dark again, never left to struggle. I don't need a beach house, Max, I said, my voice firm but gentle. What I need is to know that I can trust again. What I need is for things to go back to the way they were. He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip tight, as if he was holding on to the last thread of something he was afraid to lose. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't see it. I didn't see what was happening. But I promise you, I'll never let anyone hurt you again, not as long as I'm here. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. Part of me wanted to believe him, to believe that things would go back to the way they were. But another part of me, one that had learned the hard way to trust only myself, was hesitant. How could I trust him when everything had changed? How could I believe that the person who had been so caught up in his own success hadn't seen what was happening to me? But as I opened my eyes and looked at him, I realized something. Max had been caught in the same web of lies that Isabelle had spun, and he had just as much to lose as I did. He wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But we were family, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding. I believe you, Max, I said quietly, my voice filled with uncertainty, but also something else, hope. But it's going to take time. I'm going to need time to heal from this. He nodded, his face softening. I'll be here, Mom, every step of the way. As the days passed, I began to feel a shift. Max's presence in my life became more consistent, less about guilt and more about a true desire to make things right. The legal battles were still ongoing, and Isabelle's fate was still uncertain. But I felt a glimmer of hope that, in the end, we would find a way through this mess. It wouldn't be easy, but with time, I knew I could rebuild, not just my life, but my trust in the people I loved. And for the first time in a long while, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a future worth looking forward to. The weeks continued to blur together, and the legal battle against Isabelle's fraud became a constant, draining presence in my life. Max and I had spent hours at meetings, combing through every piece of evidence, trying to untangle the web of deceit she had created. The paperwork was endless, and every time we thought we were making progress, a new complication would arise. There were accounts to freeze, records to recover, and endless calls with lawyers and investigators. The whole thing felt like an exhausting game of catch-up. But amidst all the chaos, I found myself thinking more and more about what I needed beyond the legal proceedings. Beyond the money, beyond the beach house, what I needed was peace. For the first time in my life, I began to consider the possibility that I didn't need to chase after what I had once believed to be essential. For so long, I had defined my worth by the sacrifices I made, the struggles I endured. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just endured enough hardship, eventually things would get better. But Isabelle had stolen so much more than just money from me. She had taken my sense of security, my trust in my own family, and my belief in the kindness of others. And as much as I wanted to fix everything, to make things right, I knew the most important thing I could do for myself was to reclaim my peace. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in small, quiet moments. The first time I stood in the kitchen and didn't feel that familiar tightness in my chest. The first time I sat on the couch without feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin the healing process. I wasn't ready to forgive Isabelle, not yet, but I was beginning to understand that forgiveness, for me, wasn't about letting her off the hook. It was about releasing myself from the burden of anger that had been weighing me down. Max had kept his promise to me. He was there every day doing what he could to help fix the mess Isabelle had created. But our relationship was still fractured in ways I couldn't quite explain. There were moments when we would sit in silence, each of us thinking about the past and what had been lost, but neither of us knowing how to bridge that gap. I wasn't angry at him, not anymore, but the distance was undeniable. I had spent so many years putting him first, and now I was left picking up the pieces of a shattered trust. It hurt. But it was a hurt I could manage, because deep down, I knew that healing would take time. Max and I had gone through the motions of family dinners and legal meetings, but something had changed. He was different now, not just because of the guilt he carried, but because he had seen the depth of Isabelle's betrayal. He was no longer the confident, driven man I had once known. He was more fragile now, more vulnerable, and I could sense it in the way he looked at me, in the way he hesitated before speaking, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, I could feel the tension between us like a thick fog. Max had been quiet, his eyes cast downward, as though searching for the right words to say. The silence between us felt heavy, but I knew we had reached a turning point. He couldn't keep apologizing for what had happened, and I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "I've been thinking," Max said, breaking the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything, about you, and about me." I waited for him to continue, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I know I've messed up," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I know I let you down. I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. And I'm sorry. I wish I could go back and fix it, but I can't." I nodded, my throat tight as I tried to process his words. "Max," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I've heard you say that 100 times, but I need you to understand something. It's not just about what you missed. It's about what Isabelle did to both of us. I can't keep living in the past. I can't keep holding on to anger." He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite identify. Regret, guilt, maybe even fear. "I get that. I do. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. Not yet, at least. But I need to make it right. I need you to know that I'm going to fix this, whatever it takes." I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. The air between us was thick with emotion, but there was something else there, too. A glimmer of hope, maybe. I didn't know if Max could ever fully make up for the damage that had been done, but in that moment, I knew he was trying. And that was all I could ask for. "I don't need you to fix everything," I said, my voice soft but steady. "I just need you to be here. For me. Not because of guilt, but because you want to." Max nodded, his expression softening. "I do want to, Mom. More than anything." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us lost in thought. The road ahead was still long, and there were so many things we had to work through. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace settle in my chest. Maybe things wouldn't go back to the way they were, but maybe that wasn't what I needed anymore. Maybe what I needed was to find a new way to connect with Max, one that didn't rely on old expectations or past mistakes. In the days that followed, I focused on the small things, getting out of bed each morning, cooking dinner without feeling overwhelmed, allowing myself to breathe without the constant weight of stress. I started to feel like myself again, even if just for a moment, and it was a relief. The truth was, I was still angry, still hurt by what had happened, but I was learning how to let go. I was learning how to move forward. One afternoon, Max took me out to lunch at a small cafe near my apartment. The weather had been mild, and we sat outside under an umbrella, sipping iced tea and talking about anything and everything except the betrayal that had torn us apart. For the first time in a long while, we were able to talk without the weight of the past hanging over us. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for me, that was enough. Max had told me he was going to work on his relationship with Isabelle, and I could see the determination in his eyes. But I also saw the shift in him, the way he was learning to prioritize the people who truly mattered. It was a slow process, but I could tell that he was beginning to understand what it meant to truly be there for someone. As we finished lunch, Max paid the bill, and we walked back to my apartment, the conversation flowing easily between us. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope for the future. Things had changed, yes, and they might never be the same again, but that didn't mean they couldn't get better. It didn't mean I couldn't rebuild my life. With time, with patience, I would find my way. And so would Max. We didn't have all the answers, and there was still so much healing to do. But we had time, and for now, that was enough. The days began to feel less like a constant struggle, and more like a series of small victories. The weight of everything that had happened hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, becoming something I could carry more easily. Max and I were still navigating the aftershocks of Isabelle's betrayal, but there was something different now. A sense of understanding had started to blossom between us, a quiet acknowledgement that while the damage couldn't be undone, there was still room to rebuild. We weren't where we used to be, but we weren't as far apart as we had been either. I spent a lot of time alone in those days, reflecting on everything that had transpired. I couldn't help it. There was still a gnawing ache deep within me, a question I couldn't shake. How had I not seen the signs? How had I, someone who had always prided myself on being observant, been so blind to what was happening right in front of me? It was hard not to feel foolish, to not wonder if I had somehow missed the warning signs, if I had let Isabelle in when I should have kept her at arm's length. But the truth was, she had been so good at playing the part of the caring, supportive daughter-in-law. She had seemed so genuine, so loving. I had let my guard down, and in doing so, I had been taken advantage of. Max had told me more about the steps he was taking to recover the stolen money. The lawyers were working on tracing the funds, on retrieving the assets Isabelle had hidden, and on making sure the legal consequences for her actions were as severe as possible. The news didn't bring me as much comfort as I thought it would. Yes, I wanted the money back. Yes, I wanted Isabelle to face the consequences of her actions. But what mattered most to me now was my peace of mind, and I wasn't sure that recovering the money would restore that. In some ways, it felt like a hollow victory. Isabelle had taken so much more than just money from me. She had taken my trust, my sense of security, and my belief in the goodness of people. Max had become a constant presence in my life again. He wasn't just involved in the legal battles now, he was actively trying to reconnect with me, to make sure I wasn't left to deal with the aftermath of all of this alone. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when we would sit together in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts, unsure of how to navigate the new dynamics between us. But there were also moments, small but meaningful, when I saw a glimpse of the son I had raised, the son who had promised me he would always take care of me. One evening, after a long day of paperwork, we sat together at the kitchen table, eating dinner in silence. I could feel the distance between us, but it wasn't as sharp as it used to be. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was just quiet. After a few minutes, Max put his fork down and looked at me, his eyes tired but steady. "Mom," he said, his voice calm but serious, "I know I've messed up. I know I can't take back what happened, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I need you to know that I'm here for you, not just because I feel guilty, but because I want to be. I want to make sure you're okay, that you're taken care of, and that we can start moving forward." I put my fork down too, my stomach feeling tight. I had heard these words from him before, but there was something different in the way he said them now. It wasn't just an apology, it was a promise. And for the first time, I felt like he was really ready to live up to it. "I know you're trying, Max," I said, my voice soft, "and I appreciate that, but it's going to take time. I can't just forget what happened, and I can't pretend like everything is fine when it's not. But I also know that we can't stay stuck in the past. We have to move forward, even if it's slowly." Max nodded, his eyes meeting mine with understanding. "I get it, Mom, and I'm not asking you to forget. I just want to be part of your life again. I want us to rebuild what we lost, even if it's a long road." I smiled, feeling the warmth of his words sink into me. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a real one. And that was enough for me. In the days that followed, Max kept his promise to be there, not just in the legal sense, but emotionally as well. He checked in with me more often, came over for dinner, and we began to talk about things that weren't related to the fraud or the legal battles. It wasn't easy, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Slowly, I began to let him back in. I wasn't ready to completely forgive him for not seeing the truth sooner, but I was willing to try. I was willing to try because, deep down, I knew that family wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, understanding, and learning from the mistakes we made. One evening, as we sat in the living room after dinner, Max told me about his plans for the future. He had been thinking about expanding his business, moving into new markets, and exploring new opportunities. But he also said something that struck me deeply. He told me that he was learning to balance his work life with his personal life, to make sure he didn't repeat the same mistakes he had made with Isabelle. He said he didn't want to lose touch with the people who mattered most to him, and that he was going to focus more on the relationships in his life. It was a simple statement, but it hit me harder than I expected. Max had spent so much of his life building his business that he had neglected the people who mattered most. And now he was realizing the importance of balance, of connection, of family. I couldn't help but feel proud of him. It wasn't easy for him to admit his mistakes, to own up to the fact that he had put his work before his loved ones. But in that moment, I saw a glimpse of the man he was becoming, and I couldn't help but hope that we would both come out of this stronger. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel more like myself again. The legal battles weren't over, and Isabelle's actions still haunted me in the quiet moments. But I was learning how to live with the pain, how to let go of the anger that had threatened to consume me. I wasn't ready to forget what had happened, but I was beginning to understand that the future was more important than the past. I wasn't going to let Isabelle's betrayal define me. I wasn't going to let it take away my peace any longer. Max and I weren't where we used to be, but we were getting there. Slowly but surely, we were rebuilding. It wasn't perfect, and there were still a lot of questions left unanswered, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the right path. And that was enough for me, for now. It had been several months since the Thanksgiving that changed everything, and though life had settled into a new rhythm, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. The weight of what Isabelle had done still hung over me, but with each passing day, it became a little easier to breathe. The legal battles were still ongoing, the money was still being recovered, and the house, my house, was finally being returned to me. But those things didn't matter as much as they used to. What mattered most now was the shift that had occurred within me. I had spent years being strong for everyone else, constantly putting others first, always making sure that Max had what he needed. But somewhere in all of this, I had forgotten to care for myself. I had forgotten that my peace, my own well-being, mattered just as much as anyone else's. Max had done everything he could to help me through the legal process. He had hired the best lawyers, secured the evidence, and worked tirelessly to make sure that I was compensated for what I had lost. But even with all his efforts, there was a part of me that still felt disconnected from him. It wasn't his fault, not really. I knew he had been manipulated just as I had, and I could see the guilt in his eyes every time we spoke. But the truth was, I had to do this for myself. I had to learn to trust again, not just him, but myself. I had to believe that I could rebuild what had been broken, that I could take the pieces of my life and put them together in a way that made sense, in a way that would allow me to move forward without looking over my shoulder at the past. Max and I had begun to find our way back to each other, but it wasn't easy. There were still moments when I felt that old resentment creeping in, the feeling that I had been abandoned when I needed him most. He had been so consumed with his business, so focused on building his empire, that he hadn't seen what was happening under his own roof. He hadn't known about Isabelle's betrayal, not until it was too late. But he was trying now, and maybe that was enough. Maybe forgiveness didn't require perfection. Maybe it just required the willingness to move forward, to acknowledge the mistakes, and to learn from them. Max had been raised to be strong, to be self-sufficient, but in some ways, he had forgotten how to connect, to really connect with the people who mattered most to him. But he was learning, and so was I. I spent a lot of time reflecting in those days, walking around my apartment, watching the sun set through the windows, and thinking about what I wanted from the future. I had always been the one to take care of things, to take care of Max, to take care of the house, to make sure everything ran smoothly. But now, I was learning to take care of myself. I wasn't sure exactly what that looked like yet, but I was starting to see the pieces fall into place. I wanted to be at peace with the choices I had made, to stop looking back and regretting, to stop holding on to the anger that had consumed me for so long. One evening, Max came over, like he often did. The guilt was still there, hanging between us like an unspoken question, but it had softened somewhat. We were sitting in the living room, the smell of dinner still lingering in the air, when Max finally spoke. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything," he said quietly, his eyes focused on the floor, as if gathering the courage to say something important. "I've been thinking about how we've been moving forward, about where we are now." I waited, letting him gather his thoughts, unsure of where this conversation was headed. There had been a lot of apologies, a lot of promises made, but something in his tone made me think that this time was different. "I know it hasn't been easy," Max continued, still avoiding my gaze. "And I know I can't fix everything, but I want you to know that I'm here, not just because I feel guilty, but because I want to be here. I want to be the son you need me to be, not the one I've been." I felt a lump form in my throat as I listened to him. It wasn't just the words that struck me. It was the vulnerability in his voice, the rawness of the emotion he was trying to convey. I had always known Max to be strong, to be self-assured, but this was different. He was admitting that he had failed, and he was asking for the chance to make it right. And as much as I wanted to stay angry, as much as I wanted to hold on to the hurt, I knew that this was the moment I had been waiting for. "Max," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "I don't need you to fix everything. I just need you to be here. And I need you to understand that healing takes time. I'm still learning how to trust again, not just you, but myself. I don't know if I can forgive Isabelle anytime soon, but I'm learning how to let go of the anger that's been eating at me." Max looked up at me, his eyes softening with understanding. He reached across the table and took my hand, holding it gently, as if grounding himself in the connection. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'll be here, every step of the way, for whatever you need. You don't have to do this alone." I squeezed his hand, feeling a sense of peace settle in my chest for the first time in months. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. Over the next few weeks, things began to feel more manageable. The legal process was still ongoing, and Isabelle was still facing the consequences of her actions, but I wasn't consumed by it anymore. I had started to find my balance, and I was learning to enjoy the small moments again. I spent more time at home, organizing the things that had been left untouched for so long. I spent afternoons reading, walking through the park, and meeting up with old friends who had been a part of my life before everything had gone wrong. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had buried under the weight of responsibility, and it felt freeing. Max continued to show up for me in ways that were subtle but meaningful. He didn't just check off the boxes of guilt. He made an effort to be present, to listen, and to truly understand where I was coming from. We didn't talk about Isabelle much anymore, but when we did, it wasn't with anger. It was with the understanding that things had happened, and we could either move forward or remain stuck. And I wasn't going to stay stuck. One afternoon, Max suggested we go for a walk by the lake, a place we used to visit when he was younger. It was one of those places that always made me feel at peace, and I hadn't been there in years. As we walked side by side, the cool breeze against our skin, the sound of the water lapping at the shore, I realized that this was what I had been searching for. It wasn't a beach house or a new set of possessions. It was this. These small, quiet moments where I could just be myself, with Max by my side, without the weight of the past dragging us down. We didn't need to say much. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was familiar, like we were both finding our way back to each other in our own time. I had spent so much of my life focusing on what I didn't have, on what had been taken from me, that I had forgotten to appreciate what I did have. A son who was trying to make things right, and a life that, though imperfect, was still worth living. As we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, I looked at Max and smiled. "Thank you, Max," I said softly, "for being here, for trying." Max smiled back, the weight of everything finally lifting from his shoulders. "I'm just glad to be here, Mom, with you." And in that moment, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together. It wouldn't be easy, but we were stronger now, and that was enough. Life can throw unexpected challenges our way, and it's easy to feel lost or betrayed when those we trust most let us down. But the most important lesson I've learned through hardship is that our peace and happiness can't be dependent on others. It's crucial to take care of yourself, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Trust yourself, even when others may not meet your expectations. The pain of betrayal, while deep, can be healed over time if you focus on rebuilding your strength and peace. Understand that forgiveness doesn't mean excusing others' wrongs. It's about letting go of the anger that weighs you down. Moving forward requires patience, not only with others, but with yourself. Sometimes we must let go of the past to embrace the future. Relationships, whether with family or friends, require effort, but they also require boundaries and honesty. Don't be afraid to ask for what you need, and don't let fear of conflict prevent you from standing up for yourself. And remember, it's okay to prioritize your well-being. Life will always have its ups and downs, but the key is learning how to navigate them with grace, trust, and an unwavering belief in your ability to overcome.